Yeah, put that close where I can get it. Okay, hold on, let me get your presentation. Your time doesn't start till I get it up. You're good.
All right.
Which one's yours?
Mine is,
What's the, just tell me the subject.
it's stabilized approaches.
There you go.
All right, so my name is Lee Roberts. I am a relatively new member down in the Phantom Squadron in Spanish Fork. Been a flight instructor for about 12 years, I think. No, longer than that, 20 years. 20 years. But just kind of getting back into it. But I was asked to speak a little bit about stabilized approaches in civil air patrol. And I was told that this might be a topic that may be a little controversial for some people. Some people might not think that stabilized approaches are a great idea. Just so that I can make sure that I address any concerns, is there anybody that has an issue with the idea of doing a stabilized approach? Okay, that's fair enough. I'll just continue then, and hopefully I can address any concerns that are out there. We can go to the next.
Yeah.
Is it right here? Okay, cool.
Hold on. Go ahead.
There we go. I was not checked out on the remote, correct. So from the AOPA Air Safety Institute null report from 2020, these are some statistics that they had for general aviation. Landing accounted for 22% of non-commercial general aviation accidents. Landing accidents involved 49% private pilots, 20% commercial pilots, 14% ATP pilots, and 10% student pilots. 91% of landing accidents occurred in day VMC conditions. 88% of those landing accidents involved single-engine aircraft, and 34% of landing accidents implicated inadequate energy management, which is kind of the point of stabilized approaches. And the whole point of that is that this is kind of the realm as CAP pilots that we generally operate in. These are, largely the areas that we're working in. And lest we think that as civil air patrol pilots we fall outside of those statistics, here are some examples of different accidents with civil air patrol. This one, while conducting touch and go landings, the airplane touched down about 2/3 down the runway. On the go phase of the maneuver, the pilot established a nose-high attitude followed by a right descending roll, followed by the subsequent collision with trees. The NTSB determined the probable cause to be the pilot's failure to maintain airspeed during the takeoff and initial climb, which resulted in an inadvertent stall and the subsequent collision with trees. Where did this accident actually start?
Landing 2/3 down the runway.
Landing 2/3 down the runway. It wasn't an issue with the takeoff and the stall. It was an issue with an unstabilized approach, right? And that's kind of a theme that we'll see with a lot of these incidents and accidents. And all of these are coming from the NTSB reports on these accidents. The second one, during civil air patrol evaluation flight, which that should raise a red flag right there, right? So this is during a flight evaluation, the check pilot decided to demonstrate a power off landing. The pilot witness reported that over the runway threshold, I'm going to back up here because it's hard for me to read from the side. Over the runway threshold, the airspeed was 84 knots, the altitude was 20 feet, and the airplane touched down 1/2 to 2/3 down the runway with 1,000 feet of runway remaining. Followed by heavy braking, some swerving, a loss of control, and the airplane exited the left side of the runway near the departure end of the runway. The airplane nosed over and sustained substantial damage. The NTSB determined the probable cause of this accident to be the check pilot's failure to go around and the subsequent long landing and his failure to maintain directional control, which resulted in a runway excursion. Okay, that was in the California area. I don't remember exactly where. Somebody came out in their golf cart to check it out. The next one, during the approach to runway 23, the aircraft encountered a variable crosswind with updrafts and downdrafts. The pilot reported that during the landing roll, the wind direction may have shifted to a tailwind and that the brakes did not have the normal stopping effect. The airplane overran the runway and struck a fence. before coming to rest about the time of the accident. The wind was from 350 at 24 knots, gusting to 33 knots. If you're landing on runway 23, what's that crosswind on that? Yeah, there's a tailwind. There's also a substantial crosswind that's outside of our limits. The NTSB determined the probable cause of this accident to be the pilot's decision to land with the tailwind and variable crosswind and downdraft and updraft conditions on a wet runway, which resulted in a runway overrun. This next one is particularly tragic. This way?
Sorry. Oh, go ahead.
There we go. The student pilot, this was a cap cadet, was heard on the CTAF announcing her intention to land and was observed approaching the runway with a tailwind. The airplane did not touch the runway, and about midfield started to climb at a steep angle. According to witnesses, the airplane appeared to be struggling to maintain airspeed, was nose up, and appeared to be very close to stalling. The witness indicated that the airplane then made a hard left turn and lost altitude, struck the ground, and slid to nearby trees. A ground fire subsequently occurred. The cap cadet perished as a result of burns that were sustained during the fire. The NTSB determined the probable cause of this accident to be the student pilot's failure to maintain airplane control during a go-around with a tailwind, which resulted in an uncontrolled descent and impact with terrain. I'd like to solicit some comments on this. Who's responsible for this? The instructor? Anything else?
I mean, they should be in constant communication, right? If it's pilot solo,
They should be. She was coming back from a cross-country flight, so it wasn't necessarily that the instructor was there monitoring her communications. But who else might be responsible? The student pilot. Okay. Cadets, how many orientation flights have you taken? 5?
Yeah, 5.
5 also? Okay. On those orientation flights, what have you learned?
Mainly just basic controls, basic concepts.
What have your orientation pilots taught you about the principles of a stabilized approach? Do you know what a stabilized approach is?
It's
Okay.
so long since I've done my flights.
Okay, so this is important. Okay, as pilots, whether we're orientation pilots, whether we're mission pilots, whether we're transport mission pilots, whether we're evaluators or instructors, we're modeling a behavior for the people who watch us, whether they're pilots or not, whether they're cadets or seniors. We're modeling a behavior that the cadets and the other pilots that the other people that we fly with are going to observe and learn from. And so every pilot that this person flew with was modeling a behavior for her that she was either incorporating into her own flying or not incorporating. And so her instructor certainly bears a burden of responsibility in this instance, but I think that every pilot that she flew with also bears some responsibility for what happened here. And that's a heavy burden for us to carry, isn't it? Okay, but that's the burden that we carry as pilots. The last accident here, during the approach and configured with 20 degrees of flaps, the student pilot began drifting left of the runway center line. He applied power to extend the touchdown point while trying to reestablish the airplane over the runway center line when the airplane dropped suddenly onto the runway and began to porpoise. Before the pilot could recover, the airplane dropped heavily a second time, resulting in the nose wheel separating and the airplane departing the left side of the runway. The pilot reported that he likely flared too high over the runway and that he should have executed go-around rather than attempt to land on that approach. The NTSB determined the probable cause of this accident to be the student pilot's improper landing flare, which resulted in a hard landing. So we see a lot of different incidents here, and all of these kind of have the same issue of unstabilized approaches. So to kind of go to something that Colonel Hess was talking about earlier, I wanted to refer to a portion of the CAP oath of membership. We've all taken this oath, and a portion of that says, I voluntarily subscribe to the objectives and purposes of the Civil Air Patrol and agree to be guided by the CAP core values, ethics policies, Constitution and bylaws, regulations, and all applicable federal, state, and local laws. So, with particular reference to the CAP core values, we have values of integrity, volunteer service, excellence, and respect. And we had a discussion in our squadron a few weeks ago about how we develop excellence in Civil Air Patrol. What does that mean to you? Specifically with regard to the oath that you've taken. Right.
I think we need to be constantly working on improving our skills. So one of the things that I personally do is every landing, I am attempting to do it to commercial short field landing standards. Now that doesn't mean I succeed every time, but every time I land, if I'm trying to put that airplane down with a stable approach and landing in my touchdown zone to commercial short field standards, then I'm always working on the most critical phase of flight, which is landing.
Anyone else? Yeah.
I think to me, it's doing the best that we can do in all situations. Whether we're flying or whether, we're representing CAP to the community or whether we're in a CAP meeting itself. But certainly, flying is, for me, continual improvement.
Absolutely. Steve.
When I was in college, the extension service there had the motto, when you're through learning, you're through. Going further, there's a aviation website that the instructor at the end of it says, remember, a good pilot is always learning. So as a pilot, as anything else, if I learned something new today, and with what I did, where can I improve? And will I remember that next time to work on that?
Thank you. So the stabilized approach concept is a tool to help us develop excellence as pilots, and I like what you said about continual improvement, because that's really what it is. It's a tool for us to develop continual improvement. I've flown with some truly excellent pilots. I won't say that it's impossible to be an excellent pilot without flying a stabilized approach, but I've never seen an excellent pilot who didn't fly stabilized approaches. We was asked about the definition of stabilized approaches earlier. Several years ago, when I was driving back and forth to Spanish Fork, they were doing construction on the freeway down there. And when they were doing the construction down there, Paul, you may remember this, they would change the lane lines almost every day down there on the freeway. And when it rained at night, you could not see the lane lines. Is that difficult to know where your lane is when there are no lines? Yeah. Really, what the stabilized approach is doing is it's helping us to define where that area of safety is that we're supposed to be. The stabilized approach, this is defined in that FAA Airplane Flying Handbook. A stabilized approach is one in which the pilot establishes and maintains a constant angle glide path towards a predetermined point on the landing runway. It's based on the pilot's judgment of certain visual cues and depends on maintaining a constant final descent airspeed and configuration. So there's several elements in here that I want to point out. First of all, we're establishing and maintaining, so that's two different things. We have to establish and then maintain a constant angle glide path. Okay, what's the typical glide path? 3 degrees. Okay, we'll look at some variations to that, but we're maintaining a constant angle glide path towards a predetermined point on the landing runway, right? So we're not aiming short of the runway. We're aiming at a point on the runway. There are a few situations where aiming short of the runway might be appropriate, but not in what we're doing. Okay? And it depends on maintaining a constant final descent airspeed and configuration. Okay? So we'll summarize those elements here. And we'll add, let's see, there's just a couple here that are added in addition to that. One is the power setting. In general, your power setting on a stabilized approach should not be at idle. The only exception to that would be if we're practicing power off landings, but generally we should not be at an idle power setting when we're in a stabilized approach. And then making sure that our briefings and checklists are completed. And that kind of goes towards what Greg was saying about making sure when we're on the 45 that we should have an idea of whether this is going to be a good landing or not, right? So first of all, the glide path. We mentioned typically that's 3 degrees to the touchdown zone. And this is, I think I got this off of FAAST document talking about stabilized approaches. And they point out that the higher we get on our glide path, the more likely we are to have an unstabilized approach. And in particular, it points out that if we're 50% higher than the glide path, our chances of having an unstable approach go up 2.3 times. Okay? Why is it that we're more likely to have an unstable approach with a high glide path than with a low glide path?
You'll be making some abrupt changes right down at the end.
Okay?
Yeah, like we talked about earlier, the compound error.
Okay, compounded error. Anything else?
You can always put in a little more power if you're low, but if you're high, you just start doing slips and more extravagant things to correct. So you can put yourself in more dangerous situations correcting problems.
Okay, yeah, so when we're high, what's our natural tendency to try and get back down to the glide path? What do we generally tend to do? Okay, so we push the nose over, right? And as we push the nose over, what happens to our energy? Yeah, it's increasing. It stays the same. Really, it stays the same. We're transferring our energy from potential energy into kinetic energy, but it stays the same. We really haven't gotten rid of it. And so we're changing our altitude to airspeed. So with that in mind, we're really not changing our overall situation, right?
Actually, sometimes you want to go the other direction, pull the power off, and pull the nose up.
Okay, why?
Because that increases your drag.
Okay, it increases our drag. What else does it do?
Well, when you increase drag, you're going to deplete your energy, and as you deplete your energy, you get back into what you need for the approach.
If we
stabilize the approach is energy management.
Okay, if we've decreased our airspeed, what else have we done?
Increase the time to get down.
We've increased our time to get down. Okay, and that's an important point. So that doesn't necessarily mean that we want to be getting ourselves onto the backside of the power curve or getting below our approach speed, but we need to understand energy management and this principle that if we're high on the glide path, pitching the nose down is not going to have the effect that we want necessarily. Yeah, Mike.
Gary Rogers said that you carry more potential energy with altitude.
You do, but eventually you have to get rid of that potential energy to get down, right? Okay, next slide here. Heading and bank angle, we want to make sure that the aircraft tracks the center line to the runway with only minor heading and pitch changes necessary to correct for wind or turbulence to maintain alignment. Bank is normally limited to 15 degrees once established on final. Airspeed. The aircraft speed is within plus 10. What's that? Aircraft speed is within plus 10 or minus 5 knots of the recommended landing speed specified in the aircraft flight manual, 1.3 VSO or approved placards and markings. If the pilot applies a gust factor, indicated airspeed should not decay below the recommended landing speed. Okay. I'll kind of come back to these in a little bit, but in the interest of time, I'm going to zip through these just a little bit. Configuration, the aircraft is in the correct landing configuration with flaps as required, landing gear extended, and is in trim. This is important because how do we maintain airspeed on our approach?
Pitch for airspeed, power for altitude.
Okay, in level flight, if I'm trimmed for 100 knots, and I take my hands off the controls, and I pull the power back, what's the airplane going to do?
Pitch up to maintain 100 knots.
I pull the power back. I have it trimmed out for 100 knots, okay, in level flight, and I pull the power back. The nose is going to descend. What airspeed is it going to descend at? 100 knots, because I have it trimmed for 100 knots. If I add full power, what's it going to do? It's going to climb at 100 knots. So if I have it trimmed for my approach speed, if I get distracted by something else, which shouldn't happen, but if I get distracted by something else, is it going to maintain that speed? Yes. Okay. So trim is really important.
10 minutes.
Thank you. Next, descent rate. A constant descent rate, generally 500 to 1,000 feet per minute for light general aviation aircraft, makes for a safe approach. Minimum adjustment to the descent rate as the airplane approaches the runway provides an additional indication of stabilized and safe approach. If using a descent rate in excess of 500 feet per minute due to approach considerations, the pilot should reduce the descent rate prior to 300 feet above ground level. How can we calculate the approach speed, the descent rate required to maintain a 3-degree glide path? Oh, it hurts.
I have to look this one up all the time.
It's not too difficult.
It's ground speed times.
It's ground speed times 5, or 15% of your ground speed. Okay, so if we're doing a ground speed of 100 knots, that's 500 feet. 500 feet per minute gives us a 3-degree glide path at a ground speed of 100 knots. And so that's kind of a good way to kind of do some quick and dirty math to figure out what descent rate is going to be appropriate for your 3-degree glide path. With that in mind, if I'm on a 3-degree glide path and all of a sudden I look and notice that my descent rate is 800 feet per minute, is something wrong?
Something's changed.
Something changed. Yeah. So we might want to look at the big picture and see what else is going on there. Maybe my winds have changed. Maybe my power setting is off. Yeah, something is not quite what we anticipate that it's supposed to be. And so that should clue us in to some other factors. Okay. No power setting, we already talked about this a little bit. The pilot should use a power setting appropriate for the aircraft configuration and not below the minimum power for the approach as defined by the aircraft flight manual. Briefings and checklists. Completing all briefings and checklists prior to initiating the approach except the landing checklist ensures the pilot can focus on the other elements of the stabilized approach. By the way, these elements came out of the FAA's aircraft flight manual. So if you want to reference some additional information about stabilized approaches, that's a place that you can go to do that. So does this mean that we can't, that we don't have the flexibility to adapt to changing conditions? Are we so constrained that we don't have the flexibility to adapt to changing weather, runway, or operational conditions? Absolutely not. What it means is that we're going to call our shot. And this goes back to what Greg was saying about on the 45, already knowing how we're going to be conducting that approach. Okay. And specifically, Greg asked me to talk about what we can do to incorporate the stabilized approach principles into our operations in Civil Air Patrol. Really what stabilized approaches are about is being intentional about the way that we fly the airplane and the way that we do our approaches. And so some of the things that we can do, we can brief our crew on the aiming point, the approach speed, and the configuration, and we can ask them to call out deviations from those things, okay? This is one of the ways that we model this for non-pilots and cadets that we're flying with. We specify non-standard glide slope and descent rates. Okay, sometimes it might be appropriate for us to use a 3.5 or 4 degree glide path in certain conditions. If we're flying into a short field that has obstacles on the end of the runway, we might need a steeper descent rate. But that's not something that we should be figuring out when we're 500 feet above ground. We should already have that briefed and have that intention of how this is going to be a different approach than what we normally do. Brief the go-around procedure and be prepared to execute it. This is really important. Most accidents, at least 2 of the accidents that we looked at, and most accidents in general are less likely to happen on the approach than they are on the go-around, because people don't do a go-around very often. They aren't anticipating that go-around. And so it's, because of that, they're kind of making it up as they go along. Okay, so make sure that you brief how you're going to execute that go-around and be prepared for it. Finally, debrief each landing and invite feedback from other crew members. Okay? Yeah.
Just one thing, the high performance PCT's profile, which is number 10, it requires a go around. It also requires a no flap down. So pay attention. Those are things we can practice on a regular basis.
In the back.
I've noticed over the years that some pilots don't want to do a go around because of their stride. The go around is a maneuver. It's not swallowing your pride. I mean, it's just not lining up. It's not lining up. You'll go around and come to it.
Absolutely, right.
One of the things that we do at Flight Academy is we teach landings with only 20 degrees of flaps to make go-arounds easier to do for student pilots.
And with that in mind, that kind of goes back to this idea here. You can do it with full flaps, or you can do it with 20 degrees of flaps, but that should be something that's briefed before you even get on the 45, right? It's something that's done before we come into the traffic pattern, so that that's the expectation, and we're not making that decision at 500 feet on final. Anyone else? Yeah.
I was gonna say on the go around, if you say in your pre-briefing, either to yourself or your crew or whoever, if these things, this is what we're looking for, if I don't have that at this point, we're going around, you've already made the decision instead of, oh, this doesn't feel right, should I go, well, maybe not. If you ever find yourself saying this is kind of stupid, it is, change it.
Yeah, for me, I know it's time to do something different when I can hear the NTSB report in my head. Really, the stabilized approach concept and criteria, it's not a rigid cage that binds us. It's a tool that we use, and it creates a baseline for what we're used to doing so that we can make small changes. And to me, I kind of compare it to making my signature on the end of my landing. Because I may land in a different airplane. I may land on grass, I may land on gravel, I may land on asphalt. I may be landing in a 20-knot crosswind, not in our airplanes, but, or with a headwind. I may be landing uphill, I may be landing downhill. But when I land that airplane, I want the people that I'm with to know that it was me that landed it. Okay? And so as we become more consistent in the way that we fly the airplane and the way that we conduct our approaches, we can make small changes to compensate for varying conditions and have that approach and landing be something that we can take pride in. It's our signature on the end of the flight. And so I'd just like to open it up to any other questions that we have or comments. Yeah.
This is really an important discussion, but there's one other part of this discussion that we're leaving out about stabilized approaches. What is a stabilized approach when the engine fails?
Anyone want to comment on
We have that as part of our preparation for every landing.
Mm-hmm.
If the engine fails, what do? When do we practice that? When do we work with what's going to happen if the engine fails in my approach? What happens if it fails on takeoff? What happens if it fails out in the middle of a flight? And what I'm seeing working with flight reviews in the flying club that I work with, pilots have neither done stalls and working with stalls. They've not done power off landings forever. They've not experienced an engine failure or what happens if you're on the climb out. You may statement of if you're trimmed for 100 and you add power, it goes to 100. No, it doesn't. Not on takeoff or not on a go around with full flaps. You go to full power trimmed for 80, you're going to stall. Very likely.
Craig, you had a comment?
What do you do for power off landings? I've been a glider pilot for about 25 years. Every approach and landing is power off. There are no go-arounds. There are no second chances. Go take some glider training. You'll learn about stabilized approaches. Because if you don't do them, it's going to be a lot of extra.
And for everybody that doesn't know, no, I just, my brain is Paul. Paul is also a glider pilot and a glider instructor. So these two you should listen to because they're glider pilots. They understand this.
Lee, thank you very much. Lee is a modest guy by nature. What he did not tell you in his introduction, that he's about a 14,000-hour pilot and recently retired from the left seat of a SkyWest RJ. So thanks, Lee. 10-minute break. The bathrooms are in the back. We got gobs of muffins and OJ. 10 minutes.